What will be the shape of things as we emerge from the COVID-19 induced pandemic? Will economic and social activity go quickly back to the old normal, the way we remember things were in December 2019, before many of us had ever heard of the term coronavirus? Or will we go forward to a new normal, where face masks and social distancing are jettisoned, but other things, like Zoom meetings or remote working, become a regular part of daily life and work? Is the pandemic an opportunity, in a way, to address some of the issues of the pre-pandemic world that we'd be doing well to adopt for the longer term? To give us some insight into that question, we're holding conversations with a variety of local and state leaders to get a perspective on that. We're starting with Dr. Edward Cameron, a Manchester resident who's a specialist in climate change, human rights, and development. Then we'll hear from Dr. Daniel French, another Manchester resident who's currently serving as the state's Secretary of Education. Then we'll conclude this segment of what we expect will turn into a multi-part series with a conversation with Violet Gannon, the Executive Director of the Manchester Community Library. We hope you'll find the series interesting and thought-provoking. In your book, you talk a lot about some of the opportunities with the climate change aspects of all this, and maybe that's as good a place to start as any. What do you see going forward coming out of this?
Well, I think the first thing is that we must use this as an inflection point to build back better rather than an excuse to return to what we had before. I think it's a normal temptation to feel nostalgia for December 2019, given everything we've been through during this year. But if we were to analyze December 2019 in a robust manner with clear eyes, we would see that the economy we had at that time was one of deep inequalities. There were more than 9 million people around the world dying prematurely every year from air pollution. There was more than 22,000 children dying of hunger every day. Here in the United States, the average family couldn't accommodate a $400 emergency expense. In our own region here, all you have to do is travel 3 hours around in any direction and you'll find towns that have been ravaged by deindustrialization, by globalization, that have opioid problems, that have underemployment, as well as problems with sufficient access to affordable healthcare. So we had an economy in 2019 that was working for the few, but not for the many. In addition to that, we had an economy that was on a collision course with the climate crisis, of course, because of our growing greenhouse gas emissions pollutants. And that meant that we were heading towards dangerous thresholds that were increasing the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events like hurricanes. We were seeing the wildfires on the West Coast. We were seeing the flooding in the Midwest. And here in our own region, we were experiencing an increase in disease vectors like, for example, tick-borne diseases like Lyme. So it's very important, I think, as we address the pandemic, that we have a vision for what a better future looks like. And that needs to be one that's low carbon. It needs to be one that's resilient, not only in the face of climate change, but in the face of other shocks like other pandemics that will likely come our way. And it needs to be an economy that is inclusive, that works for the many and not just for the few.
So I guess the question then becomes, like, how do we get there? I mean, what is the route to that? Is it a case where the government needs to kind of step in and create more programs like the CARES Act we saw earlier this year, and just spend a lot of money investing in low carbon technologies and economies to kind of get things going in that direction?
Well, you asked a question, what lessons have we learned? And I think the first lesson we've learned is that we're not very good at assessing risk. We have learned to look at risk as the exposure to a hazard. But experts on risk will always tell you that there are actually three dimensions. There's hazard, exposure, but then the critical third dimension is vulnerability. And that means the underlying weaknesses in our systems that exacerbate risk. So for example, within COVID, you see that our underlying weaknesses is a population with existing health problems, with poor diet, often suffering from obesity. You see, for example, that COVID has had a disproportionate impact on populations of color and low-income groups. You see that the elderly has been disproportionately impacted as well. Similarly, on climate change, we have exposure to hazards. We have exposure to, for example, hurricanes, but we also have that third dimension of vulnerability. We see right around the world, for example, that women are impacted more by climate change than other groups because they suffer from intersecting inequalities. So one of the things we need to do, I think, is to better diagnose and then respond to risk. A second thing we need to do is we need to fix our broken politics. Many of the best climatologists in the country, people like Jim Hansen and Bill McKibben, have taken to saying that we cannot fix the climate until we fix our politics. And we see, for example, that there has been a tribal warfare over the issue of wearing masks, which to a non-American seems quite ridiculous. We also saw a failure in Washington, D.C. to properly put in place stimulus measures to resuscitate the economy. So I think we need to address risk, we need to address politics, and the very first step, I would say, during President-elect Biden's first days in office will be to put in place a second stimulus package that is focused on low carbon, resilient and inclusive development. It needs to be an order of magnitude that will truly infuse the economy with dynamism and innovation in 2021. It needs to have conditionality imposed within it, which means we cannot simply be giving money to high carbon industries, but we need instead to be building a 21st century economy. And when you think about the volume of money that will be spent next year, we're talking about $1 trillion and more. There's an opportunity there to really build the foundations of something better. So stimulus, I think, has to be where we begin. Before the pandemic, we were really struggling to mobilize finance at scale to invest in a new economy. We were arguing every year internationally about the number $100 billion. By the end of this year, the global G20 players, United States, China, the European Union, and others, will have mobilized somewhere between 15 and $20 trillion in response to the pandemic. And we're looking at a similar order of magnitude over the next 2 to 3 years. So we now have the facility, because of this crisis, to spend money that we could have only previously dreamed about. The real question is, do we have the sense of purpose? Do we have the creativity? Do we have the courage to spend that money in the right way? Or will we waste it, as we have wasted so much money before? I believe that this stimulus, this money, provides us with an opportunity we didn't have before, and that is a source of optimism for me. Similarly, all of the technology, all of the innovation that we could possibly need to decarbonize our energy system, to decarbonize our transport system, to put in place regenerative agriculture practices, for example, that will reduce greenhouse gas pollutants, but also provide food security, they're available to us. We know what we need to do. The real question is simply, do we have the political will to spend what needs to be spent? So we know what we need to know. We have the finance available to us for the first time. We also have political change coming to the country. I would have said, if the election results earlier in November had have turned out differently, that we would have been facing another 4 lost years. But I think the incoming administration will be populated by people who really understand this issue. The president-elect has committed not only to addressing this issue through environment and energy policy, but right across the full spectrum of government. And of course, here in Vermont, we have a very active citizenry, and we have the new Global Warming Solutions Act that provides a foundation for how we might act on this issue also within our own state. So I think to be optimistic might be too much of a stretch, but I definitely see that for the first time in 4 years, we have the wind in our sails, and I'll settle for that for now.
I was struck by one thing you stated in your book about how people in the climate struggle need to get out of our lanes. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what you meant by that. Is that you're referring to people who are kind of stuck in certain silos around what needs to be done, or is it something different?
I think it's a combination of things. I think first and foremost, people working in climate or environment have tended to think of climate change as an environmental problem that will be solved with an environmental policy. So we spend a lot of our time trying to put in place new renewable energy standards, for example. But we don't look broader across public policy at things like the taxation system or public procurement or education, or even something as big and important as voting rights in the United States that often undermine the critical mass of people who would like to see leadership on this issue. So part of my argument was we need to be more creative as a community, not only focus on energy, but really look at how we change the real economy so that the real economy becomes one that is low carbon, resilient, and inclusive. What I also mean, however, is that quite often in the environment community, we've become quite lazy in terms of our outreach to those who disagree with us. We tend to populate a bubble, which is usually politically center-left. We spend a lot of our time talking to each other in echo chambers. We speak to each other's motivations, usually motivations around protection of the environment. And we haven't done enough to reach out to those who have not yet been persuaded. Those who, for example, their main focus is perhaps jobs or economic development. We need to do a better job of reaching out to those people, because one of the things this election has taught us is that there are still more than 70 million people in this country who chose not to vote for a Democrat. They chose to vote for a Republican platform that has not been ambitious for many years around the issue of climate and environment. So when I say get out of our silos, I mean let's be more creative in terms of how we approach public policy, but I also mean let's try to grow our coalition by speaking to those who have not yet been persuaded. Let's try and go out there for converts as opposed to pointing our fingers at heretics.
Next, we spoke with Dr. Daniel French, Vermont's Secretary of Education. Do you see anything coming out of this in terms of how we might be doing education in the future that will outlive the pandemic? Or is the game plan just to go back to the way we were in December of 2019?
Well, I think it's good to see you. I mean, to your question about, I think, the role of technology, I think that's an open question. I think we certainly, as imperfect as that's been, it certainly has accelerated our adoption of technology in education. And the implications there, I think, are still being sorted out. I think, on the one hand, the issues of equity, come to the forefront pretty quickly. I think, like so much with technology, it merely shines a light on some of the things that existed before. I think, our experience with technology and COVID has exposed, and let us perhaps see the patterns of inequity of opportunity that existed previously. But I think also, the opportunity side of that, I think in particular to deploy technology in an asynchronous way, meaning that much of the content in education is still confined to the school building, textbooks, and so forth. I think teachers have really learned how to deploy a lot of that sort of, I would say, lecture type material or content-based material to the web. And I think assuming students have access to that provides the opportunity for students to have greater access, basically at the moment they need to have that access, where as the in-person moments then can become more focused on engaging with that content. So I think that's sort of the pattern we've seen broadly in education, including in higher education, of sort of flipping the classroom, sometimes it's called, where sort of the lecture type activities are deployed to the cloud, and the in-class activities become more experience-based or more conversation-based and discussion-based with students to react to the content. So I think we have a lot to do there. And I think with that too, particularly since we're a rural state, to ensure that all students in the state have access to high quality instructional materials and high quality instructional experiences. So I think there will likely be more interest in distance learning and expanding curriculum offerings, particularly for our smaller rural high schools. So I think, there's some upside to the technology piece. I think setting technology aside, I think, where we're heading now, and certainly with the advent of the vaccine, we're going to need to begin to assess the impact of this emergency on students from an educational standpoint and otherwise. So the idea of integrating social services in education, making sure those services are delivered on a regional basis in the state, in all areas of the state. We have sort of an uneven delivery system right now in terms of mental health, social services, and so forth. So I think there'll be renewed focus on that as we come into the next phase of this emergency. That probably will have a long-lasting impact on particularly how we deploy the regional integration of services going forward.
One of the things that it certainly revealed to me, which probably for someone who might have been looking at this a little more carefully than I had, would come as no surprise, is the huge role schools had in feeding kids and providing meals to families who qualified for them. I guess I'm just wondering, will that continue to be a major piece of the role of schools in education? I mean, not only during, let's say, lunches and during the school days, but also distributing meals to families even when the building was closed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very important function of schools, and I think more broadly the role of schools play in just ensuring social stability in our communities. They're the hub of a lot of social activity, in addition to feeding kids and so forth. But specifically, I think the meal program in particular, I think Vermont's a real leader nationally in the quality of our school meal programs. We've had initiatives like Farm to School and so forth. So I think schools play a pivotal role in ensuring kids have access to adequate nutrition, which is an essential precondition for learning and academic achievement. So I think schools will continue, particularly in Vermont, to be on the forefront of that. But I think the broader issue, I think, people acknowledging that schools provide a very important anchor institution to communities in a lot of ways that go beyond, I would say, the traditional academics. That education and schooling particularly are more than just a commodity. It's hard to untangle schools from their communities, and in particular as this emergency unfolded, we saw pretty quickly the essential role that schools play in terms of infrastructure. And even now, as we're contemplating delivering the vaccine, I imagine schools will play a critical role in inoculating children and staff.
Have there been any insights that you and your colleagues have seen in terms of the differences between how education should be carried out for, let's say, the high school level student versus elementary, middle school? I mean, one of the things I've read a fair amount is that remote learning is particularly ineffective with younger kids, kindergarten through, let's say, sixth grade. Is that one of the takeaways you and your colleagues are coming away with, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think it's a very complex issue. I don't think it's as simple as saying, here's the one role technology plays in education, because I think, delivering a course in a learning management system is, yes, well, arguably a high school sort of or older student activity when learning is organized in the structure of a course, versus at the elementary level where learning is organized around a class, where there's many subjects being taught, usually by one teacher, particularly at the lower elementary grades. But I think technology has a role at the elementary level, in particular, reinforcing basic skills. There's a lot of good gamification, if you will, of literacy content and so forth that has been designed for the elementary level. So I think, technology is not going anywhere in terms of education. And I think certainly how we assess learning, there's a lot of work that's been done in terms of adaptive assessment and technology that's really state of the art and allowed us to really modernize our assessment practices in a lot of ways. So I think the jury's still out on the role of technology in our schools. But, once again, I think in Vermont, we've talked about some of these things for years, and there's been places where, we've made progress, but I think the emergency has thrown us all in the deep end of the pool, so to speak. And I think we need to critically evaluate the appropriate role of technology, which has always been the case, probably more so after this. I certainly don't agree in saying, well, let's snap right back to where we were, because I think there's some critical elements of this that could help us achieve our goals of equity and quality for all students. But it's not a simple issue, and it does. I think particularly we've been reflecting a lot on, what does it mean with the presidential transition? With the Biden administration coming in, what does education reform look like on a national perspective, and how might Vermont fit into that? I think, just in a general way, I think we can imagine as a country that there's going to be a need for urban education reform, which is, a perennial issue in our uneven results when we look at any kind of international comparison. The United States basically is let's say, a middle of the road performer. And to a large extent, that's due to our really poor performing urban school districts that really, we have some challenges considering we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And honestly, it's a disgrace, the quality of some of our urban education experiences. But we also have to examine, I think, rural education reform as a state. And I think this is where Vermont might inform that conversation, because I think we start thinking about opportunity, particularly for what it will be 21st century learning opportunities. Rural students need to have access to those materials, and that. So I think rural education reform is going to take shape around the issues of infrastructure. We've heard a lot of conversation in Congress about the broader picture of infrastructure, but I think there's a need to address infrastructure issue in schools and rural communities, the issues of broadband, which does, we've talked a bit about technology, but you need to have the infrastructure behind that to do it. I think education provides a very compelling application for technology in rural communities. Telemedicine is probably the other one. So I think, as a country, we're going to need to make those investments in a rural strategy in education, which also probably includes wraparound services, social services in those communities as well. So, kids in even our more rural communities will have access to a 21st century education and will have, therefore, the aspirations to go out into the world or stay in their own community, but to participate in that global economy and society.
And finally, we talked with Violet Gannon, the executive director of the Manchester Community Library.
How has the pandemic altered how libraries work, or you think will work in the future? And I guess basically Zooming and putting programs online is here to stay, or how will that interface in the library of the future post-pandemic?
Yeah, we love our library community, and I would say that the feeling is mutual, and they've been kind in helping be patient with us as we've adapted and moved from the physical space to the virtual space. And now temporarily we went back to the physical space for browsing and had to close that down last Tuesday because of the recent surge. But I think the virtual opportunities are going to stay with us, and that does open the door for a lot of people who might have access issues, be it because of disabilities, because of transportation, because it snows or sleets here, at least 10 months out of the year. So it's great in the sense that we're able to reach a different group of people. The downside of that is that there are people in any number in the community who don't have access to high-speed internet. And so those opportunities are challenging for them to avail themselves of, in the same way that pivoting from the physical collection to the virtual collection has been challenging. I think people have gotten used to curbside, be it curbside pickup of your dinner or curbside pickup of your books. And so I don't see those amenities going away. I think some people will enjoy continuing to do that.
And how does this interface with the whole evolution of libraries as community centers? 10 or 12 years ago, you went to a library to borrow a book or a videotape or something like that. But now the library, not only the Manchester Community Library, but libraries almost everywhere seem to be evolving into being places where people kind of come together and community events happen and all that sort of thing. I'm assuming we're all going to want to get back on board that train again as soon as we can.
Yeah, and I think, we serve as an ongoing place for community development, but we also serve to gestate community development and connection. So a lot of those relationships that people have formed by virtue of bumping into one another at story time at the library, we know have continued, and we've heard from patrons their gratitude for the genesis of that. But the virtual way of connecting with people, again, offers new ways of being and new ways of people connecting with us and with one another that they haven't had historically. I see that as, a piece that will stay in our portfolio as we move forward. But there is, wonderful organic experience that comes with just bumping into people, be it at an event or at a program, that we are all missing right now, that I think we will see a resurgence of. But the modern library in its current iteration has gone well beyond the four walls, and we continue to move beyond those four walls with the way we're engaging with the public.
I was just wondering, as we're talking here, you and I in the past have talked about, broadening the library's reach to serve the people who traditionally haven't thought of the library as a place to go to borrow a book, the so-called underserved population. Is this a step forward or a step backward, the whole experience of the pandemic and Zooming and online meeting? Will that advance that agenda, do you think, or slow it down?
I think it's made it and our role even more relevant because not everyone has access to technology. So when we reopened initially, it was really to open our public computers for public access. And we did so because that was the population we identified with the greatest need. A lot of us couldn't imagine, for example, opening up our emails, which we hadn't checked since March. And a lot of our patrons who came in to use that service were struggling with that exact piece. So in that way, we've become even more important. For that reason, we invested in greater service for our external Wi-Fi so that when we had to close back down the building and we couldn't make our computers available, that folks without necessarily reliable Wi-Fi service, but with the technology and the devices they needed could still access that. And we've seen any number of, groups of people coming to watch a film on Netflix. We've got remote workers who come in and use the parking lot for that opportunity. But I think, to your question of is this a step forward or is it a step backwards, this is most certainly affected the most vulnerable among us in profound ways. And we see that with food insecurity, we see that with unemployment. And the library has always been that buffer for folks to access services that they need, which when we're shut down in the ways that we have been has been particularly challenging. But we have been on site and receive phone calls regularly from patrons asking all sorts of questions that you can imagine. And we're here to be your Google if you need it. And folks have taken us up on that.
And as far as new skills that library workers will need, is it pretty much getting even more comfortable with technology and computers than folks I'm sure already were, or is there some new element to a job skill that someone might need in library science?
Mm-hmm. I think the beauty of librarians, and there are lots of them, is that they're naturally predisposed to lifelong learning and curiosity. And they're the first people that will tell you just because you have a skill set today, that doesn't mean it's going to be relevant tomorrow. So dispositionally, they were perfectly positioned to learn a whole new set of skills. And they were nothing that any of us necessarily anticipated. So, being able to record and produce your own story time on an iPad when you're alone is no act of lack of imagination. And it's certainly not something that they teach you in school. But what librarians have, as I said, is just this natural curiosity to continue to learn and evolve and grow. And most certainly for us, the biggest piece there has been in familiarizing ourselves and developing a comfort with new technologies like Zoom.
In our next segment, we'll be talking with James Condos, Vermont's Secretary of State, William Colvin, the Assistant Director and Community Development Program Coordinator with the Bennington County Regional Commission, and Alexandra Tranmer, a Senior Project Manager with Camoin Associates, an economic development consulting firm headquartered in Saratoga Springs, New York. For the GNAT-TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.